Alright guys, we're going to be going over the basics of the Monster Crown TCG. So here I just kind of laid out the basics of what the field will kind of look like. Here you have your main deck, your adventure deck, then you have the journey field, this is the player area, and over here off to the side is my laptop, but what would be known as the wild. So how gameplay generally works, you'll start off with a starter monster. There will eventually be little tamers over here on the side of these next to the starter monsters that hopefully I have play testers and stuff designing, and that would be really cool. So you start off with a tamer and a main deck of 50 cards and the adventure deck of 15 location cards. So how gameplay works, each turn, as with most games, you're going to draw a card from your main deck. You'll have a hand of 5 cards at the start. Now after you draw your card, this is where things start to get a little different from a lot of other card games. So this is where we move over to the journey field. So here, vaguely color coordinated so you guys could see it, you have where you're going to place your location cards. So at the start of your turn after you draw, you would play a location card. Now you can play a location card in any space, starting with like this row. Once you fill it, you can go to the next row. Once you fill it, you go to the next row. So you'll notice that here I just have normal location cards placed. That's because these are the only rows, are the only slots that you need to fill to move up. So if I just play 3 location cards, I can move up a row, 3 location cards, and then I'm in what's called the neutral zone. More on that in a little bit. Now these spaces over here indicated by the blue cards are what are called fringe zones. Those are going to hold your special locations, places where you find legendary monsters, bigger events, things like that. And so it just kind of has a pacing like that. Each turn, a player automatically plays a location card, so it just steadily builds up the field. And then you get to the neutral zone. So the other player is going to have the same, slots just like this. But then you guys share the neutral zone. So once the neutral zone is filled, that's when the 2 players will collide. And we'll talk about that conflict portion in a minute. So the big aim of the game is to capture a team of monsters to take against your opponent. So each round you'll have the opportunity to play monsters or NPC cards into your wild, and then you will also have the option to attack those monsters with monsters on your team and attempt to capture them. Once you have monsters on your team, you can continue to just use their kind of combined might to essentially continue adding monsters to your team. So some of the specifics of that are kind of fun in the game. So let's say that, for instance, this is Death, and he will be the first legendary in the first set. Let's say that the goal of my deck is to capture Death. Each monster that I have on my team, so for instance, Hooclaw here has a power of, it's kind of hard to see here, Hooclaw has a power of 150. It gets a buff later that gives it up to 200, and Death here has 350 and then a couple other beneficial modifiers. So how that's going to look is that, let's say that I had Hooclaw, and let me just, throw another monster out here. Let's say that I attack Death with Hooclaw. So he's going to hit him. Death obviously has more power. It will kill Hooclaw. He will then become beaten. Anytime a monster on your team is defeated in battle, it gets placed upside down to indicate that it can't be used. So then, since Death has had a little bit of experience in combat now, it's going to get what's called a wear counter. Wear counters are a cumulative counter that will build up, each one giving a minus 50. So that way you can steadily build negative, potential onto an opponent to slowly wear them down. And even if you have a team of weaker monsters, you'll be able to take down larger threats. That being said, if your team gets swept and you lose everything, you will place a location card from your board onto the bottom of your location deck, basically setting you back a turn. And the reason that this kind of matters is because there's a lot of cards that utilize your location cards as a resource. It's a new system I developed called Experience, to where an ability would say Experience, do X. How that works is you place a location card on the bottom of your deck to activate the ability. So when the conflict portion comes, when you clash with your opponent, whatever you have, there's no more turns in the game. It's just a battle, like what I displayed with Death here. So there's no more playing of cards or anything. It's just a full bout with everything you have. So if you don't have many location cards, you don't have much to go off of. And that's essentially the gist of the game, because once this neutral zone is filled, all 5 slots are filled, you and your opponent will then collide, and at that time it's going to be just 1v1 battles with each monster that you have. The last person that played a location card up there will get to wrap up their turn, and then they can they choose their active monster, your opponent chooses in kind, and you begin beating the shit out of each other. There's a lot of really interactive abilities that take place during the more adventurous side of the game. There's abilities that just when you play a monster into the wild, it'll activate there, or whenever you encounter it, it will activate there. And there's something big to note there, is that whenever you play a monster, you don't own it. So even if I played my biggest, baddest monster turn 1, it's hanging out in the woods. I don't own it yet. I haven't shown it, what I got. So let's talk about some of the different types of cards in the game. So as you've seen, we have starter monsters that will have the tamers and everything on that. We have monster cards, which, pretty excellent variety in the Monster Crown world. In total, there's something like 1,200 monsters that I get to pull from, so that's exciting. The next thing, I don't have pictures on a lot of these yet, just because, well, that's a lot of work for playtest pictures put into sleeves. So NPC cards. NPC cards work similar to monsters. They'll be played out in the wild, and then I can interact with them from there to use their effects. And I can have any amount of monsters and NPCs in my wild. Let's say that I just, for some reason, never wanted to do anything with any of them. I could just have a giant stack of things in my wild. And you do have a limited amount of actions per turn. So we'll go ahead and talk about that, since we've talked about monsters and NPCs. So each turn, you can you get 2 actions. You get to you can play up to 2 things into your wild, or you can attack 2 things in your wild, or any combination of the 2. Let your imagination go wild with all those possibilities. So you can kind of play it safe, like maybe you just need to flood the field with some things to maybe, confuse your opponent about who they should target, because there's a lot of things that can interrupt things going on out in the wild. It's a dangerous place. Or you might just want to play a thing, capture a thing. Play a thing and counter a thing, because you don't want your opponent to have as much time or ability to interact with you. There's a lot of potential there depending on the various cards. The next things that we have are going to be quest cards. So quest cards are pretty fun. Essentially, you're going to play them in your player area down here, and they will have a series of wickets that you need to meet before they activate. And sometimes they even have like play effects as well. For instance, there's one that when you play it, you search your deck for a certain monster and place it underneath of it. It basically lets you fish for that monster, and then it has a series of things that let you unlock that monster. Different things like that. The quests have various different abilities, and they can be very, very beneficial. One of the premier ones is the Adventure Begins, and basically it's just once you've done some of the preliminary things in the game, played 2 location cards, captured a monster, and encountered an NPC, you get to search your deck for 3 different cards of the types that I'm about to talk about. So you can use it to search for a quest card, a fate card, and an adventure card. So adventure cards work kind of like spells in like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or whatever the slower spells are called in Magic. It's slipping my mind at the moment. Not instances. Sorceries, there we go. They work kind of like sorceries. You can play them on your turn, not in response to any action, and they normally have pretty hefty, just powerful effects, like search for a thing, give a big bonus to a thing, etc. And there's no energy cost or anything to any of these. The only resource that we really have, I'll talk more about the location cards in a minute and how they interact with the monsters and stuff. So adventure cards basically just work like sorceries, and your fate cards work just like instants. And they have various effects like, giving bonuses to monsters, negating things, all kinds of stuff. So really with those, it's resource management. Do you want to utilize those heavily during the more adventure phase of the game to try to capture as many monsters as possible, give buffs to your things to capture big monsters to beat your opponent? Or do you want to just sit there with a hand of, bonuses and negates and tell your opponent, good luck at the end? Lot to be said. There's a lot of potential there. So as I said, the only real resource in the game, and it's hardly that, are once again the location cards, and they're used for a few different things. So the location cards have different habitats on them, like it'll be a woodlands, flatlands, waterways, etc. And your monster, to be able to play them in the wild, well, the location has to be out there. Essentially, you went to the place, you saw the thing. So for instance, this monster comes from the tundra. You have to have a tundra in play. But when I have a tundra in play, I can play any number of tundra monsters and any amount of power level of them. So once you have it out there, there's not really anything stopping you. And there's a lot of cards that let you really control your location deck and everything, or your adventure deck. So it's not really anything to stress about. And especially now with the experience system and everything, the game's pacing can vary a little more rapidly. So, don't really worry if you're not getting what you need. The deck is only 15 cards. Also, on that, you can have 3 copies of any card in your deck. That also goes for your location deck. So right now, for instance, with tundras, there are 2 different types of tundras. There's tundra monsters and tundra events. And each of those count as unique things. So you can have a total of 6 tundra cards in your 15-card location deck. So that does mean that there are no mono-type decks yet. However, diversity is your ally in this game. One of the big things in this game is that there are type advantages. There's a power wheel. There are 5 types, and whenever you have advantage against the other type, you get a 100 power bonus. So this basically, a very simple deck in this game would just fight around the power wheel to collect monsters. For instance, the brute type beats the malicious type. So I would have a brute monster. Let's say that my starter was a brute monster, and then I would play a monster that was malicious type with a higher base power, but I get the bonus. I get to capture it, add it to my team, use that malicious monster to beat a monster that it has advantage against, and the world keeps spinning. So those are, in general, the basics to the Monster Crown trading card game. You draw cards, you play locations, you build up, fill up the neutral zone, fight your opponent. Along the way, before you're doing that, you're playing monsters and NPCs and everything into your wild. You're encountering things, you're adding things to your team, and you're just growing in general. And then, you beat the shit out of your opponent. So, uh, like I said, I'll be posting just kind of monsters of the day and everything as I'm working through this. I'm doing a lot of changes right now. Um, just things that I think will be better for the game, make it play a little more fluid. Um, but I think that you guys will enjoy this, and I hope that this tutorial was understandable. All right, thank you very much.